Thank you for coming. First of all, let me apologize for its possible incoherency, because it's a work in progress. I've just started it not long ago, and I'm going to work it out after a winter dream in the spring in the framework of a research scholarship. So, first of all, a few thoughts about the interpretational framework I used for this presentation. The first one is a work by Jacques Rancière, the art philosopher, titled Communities of Sense, which I shall quote. I do not take the phrase community of sense to mean a collectivity shaped by some common feeling. I understand it as a frame of visibility and intelligibility that puts things or practices together under the same meaning, which shapes thereby a certain sense of community. A community of sense is a certain cutting out of space and time that binds together practices, forms of visibility, and patterns of intelligibility. I call this cutting out and this linkage a partition of the sensible. And then he raises a few questions. The relationship between art and politics is more precisely a relationship between the aesthetics of politics and the politics of aesthetics. How can we understand this notion of the politics of aesthetics? This question hinges on a previous one. What do we understand by the name aesthetics? What kind of community of sense does this term define? So with this case study, I'm trying to sort of answer these questions. And I quote here only the establishing thoughts of his theory. And the other one, which is very important for this case study, is related to Aleida Assmann's theory, especially the one where she analyzes the Holocaust as a global memory, and where she uses the term memory community, which I shall return later. So I'm going to analyze here a few of Péter Forgács' works, who is a video artist and a filmmaker, and he's called in an important book an alchemist, an anthropologist, an archaeologist. And I quoted here a Hungarian art historian who was the curator of one of his installations. Just using it as a motto. Oh, sorry, I'm going backward all the time. Yes. So this is a sort of random systematization of his works, because he's got a huge oeuvre. He made plenty of videos, documentaries, and also installations, and most of his works are based on private archival footages, which I should highlight here, because they are parts of private, collective, communicative memory, but as becoming or producing films, installations, they are becoming parts of our cultural memory. Yes, so first I would like to go back to the sort of origin of his works, to the precedents, and highlight here the influence of Gábor Bódi, who was an experimental filmmaker who died very young, and especially one of his documentaries called Private History, shot in 1979-8, had a very strong influence on Forgács' work. 10 years later, he produced another film, which was the first part of the Private Hungary series, using the same private archival footages. In an exhibition not long ago, in 2016, titled Meaning, it was a group exhibition in Budapest, he paid tribute to this influence. He titled actually his installation Attribution of Meaning, referring to the theoretical works of Gábor Bódi, especially the so-called serial montage theory and the feedback and delay techniques proposed by Bódi in one of his important works, Infinite Image and Reflection. So in these works, they were processing private archives and the indexical characteristics of archival films. So this work went on in the so-called Balázs Béla studio, in the early 80s, when Péter Forgács was member of the so-called K3 group, the Complex Research of Public Culture group, creating the so-called film language series, researching on the nature and characteristics of video expression. So I'm collecting this work and these theories here to Laura Mulvey's book published in 2006, The 24 Times Death. And here I used two quotations by Laura Mulvey about delayed cinema, which I found important. So delayed cinema works on two levels. First of all, it refers to the actual act of slowing down the flow of film. Secondly, it refers to the delay in time during which some detail has lain dormant, as it were, waiting to be noticed. And later on, she returns to this thought. The cinema, like photography, has a privileged relation to time, preserving the moment at which the image is registered, inscribing an unprecedented reality into its representation of the past. This, as it were, storage function may be compared to the memory left in the unconscious by an incident lost to consciousness. Both have the attributes of the indexical sign, the mark of trauma or the mark of light, and both need to be deciphered retrospectively across time. So these delayed techniques in the experimental film, first of all, undermine the linearity of diegetic time of the original footage. And I drew parallel with Mulvey's thoughts and the thoughts from a completely different source, an essay written by László Földényi F. analyzing Forgács's works. Instead of remaining mere documents, the films began to live. I, as a viewer, do not just observe a vanished world as I watch his films. I also penetrate layers of myself that I thought had vanished, conduct a dialogue with myself. What is long gone history suddenly becomes present and personal, just as the spaces of the installations are alive and personal. And I'm going to connect it to another example, which actually is highlighted in Laura Mulvey's preface, Vertov's film, and especially one scene in this film, which is an excellent example of serial montage, and was also analyzed by Gábor Bódi in one of his important writings. And it says, only one single film could preserve the archetypical cleanness of recording the vision, thus becoming the expression of the pathos of the eye, the unconditional reflex of filmmaking. Vertov's invaluable and brave work, The Man with the Movie Camera. Kino-eye, this universal metaphor of cinematography, made him possible using, in his age, exceptional freedom of observations to open a window on time. So I think Forgács's works in this understanding open a window on time too. And now I'm going to introduce you with these two works of Forgács. The first one, the Danube Exodus, was made originally as a documentary in 1998, and then it was installed in several times in different museums, and also there was a huge project in the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, the so-called Labyrinth project, where they created an installation and an online database. The other one, The Looming Fire, Stories from the Dutch East Indies, was installed in the gallery of the Eye Film Institute in Amsterdam in 2013. It is evident that there has always been a political aspect to Forgács's art, from the Private Hungary series to the latest installations. Home footages, private archival materials that he has used in his films, videos and installations are always connected to traumas of our collective memory, with particular attention paid to the Second World War and the Holocaust. In Cinema's Alchemist, the book about his oeuvre, edited by Bill Nichols and Michael Renov, there is an important text. It is a dialogue between Forgács and Bill Nichols with the title The Memory of Loss, Péter Forgács Saga of Family Life and Social Hell. It highlights Forgács' extraordinary ability for inscening the records of past historical events, rendering them in everyday banality and causing effects of pain, feelings of being overwhelmed, feelings of compassion, while at the same time asking questions about their political implications. Bill Nichols, naming Forgács as one of the most important representatives of performative documentary filmmaking, asks this question: is knowledge best described as abstract and disembodied, based on generalizations and the typical in the tradition of Western philosophy? Or is knowledge better described as concrete and embodied, based on the specificities of personal experience in the tradition of poetry, literature, and rhetoric? Performative documentary endorses the latter position and sets out to demonstrate how embodied knowledge provides entry into an understanding of the more general processes at work in society. So these somewhat random quotations lead us to the thesis of my paper, namely that those who analyze the work of Forgács usually treat the poetics and politics of his works on equal terms. One of the two is either ignored or it is sacrificed to become a reflection of the other. But his Looming Fire type works might force us to break with this tradition and ask whether his art has, of necessity, to become socially engaged art, and if that is the case, in what circumstances does it have to do so? I argue that even if Péter Forgács uses similar devices of remediation, the politics of his artistic approaches has to be based on the dynamics of the social space his works are to be shown and his source material originates in. It doesn't mean that his films do not convey universal meaning, but it means only that the framing of the archival footages, especially in the case of an installation, needs special treatment in order to create a cultural context that fosters to generating empathy. So the first installation, you can see this collage on the left-hand side, the Danube Exodus, is a travelogue in which he documents the Jewish exodus from Slovakia just before the beginning of the Second World War. In two boats, a group of 900 Slovak Austrian Jews tried to reach the Black Sea via the river Danube in order to get to Palestine from there. He filmed his passengers while they prayed, slept, and even got married. At the end of this journey, it is clear that the boat will not return empty. A reverse exodus takes place, this time of repatriating Bessarabian Germans fleeing to the Third Reich because of the Soviet invasion of Bessarabia. It was a quote from the official synopsis. And the other one, the image shows on the right-hand side, the installation Looming Fire at I-Film Museum was based on home movies that take us through everyday life in the Netherlands, East Indies, at the height of the colonial period between 900 and 940, the same historical epoch that is presented from several angles and in different regions of Europe in previous works by Forgács. But it is unique among his works since it moves us from the continent to the colonies. And yet, since the archival footages were obviously made by Dutch bureaucrats, by owners of commercial companies and their family members, it results in an Eurocentric view. Although the private footages differ a lot, there are a few things in common that invite us for comparison. Both were made in the shadow of a threatening war that, as the viewers know well, resulted in the Holocaust and many other victims in Europe and cruel invasions, victims of the War of Independence in the Dutch East Indies. The genre of travelogue is similar, although the camera of Andrea, the captain, lacks in the colonizer gaze. There is a striking difference. Danube Exodus originally was made in the form of a documentary in Forgács' experimental style and later turned into an installation, then an online database with all sorts of additional material, oral history interviews, research documents of the period. Looming Fire was produced in the form of a video installation for I-Film Museum exhibition space. They both used the same filmic devices of slow motion, freezing, delay, divided screen, inserts, and, very important, repetitive music composed by Tibor Szemző in the case of Danube Exodus, and another composer, János Másik, in the case of the Looming Fire. Okay, I'm trying to hurry up. In Looming Fire, they used personal letters instead of voiceover narration of any kind. The letters are not always written by the people we see on screen, which gives the footages a fictional character. The multiple screen installation form is also important. The stories are performed, they interweave and create layers. I can't go into a deeper analysis, but I would like to stress one thing which is at variance with the arguments of the opening lecture from the exhibition, which I shall quote later. Watching the film installations of Péter Forgács, the viewer doesn't become a passive voyeur, but rather an eyewitness who, in an ideal case of well-curated installations, becomes more involved, engaged, empathetic. These are not private films anymore. The diegetic world is not the one created in front of the camera of the original amateur filmmaker who shot them, but the one on Péter Forgács's computer in his digital editing equipment. And this is a crucial difference. To my view, I'm going backwards all the time, sorry. To my view, Laura Mulvey's theory about the possessive and pensive spectator can also be extended to these analyses, especially when we add the latest results of memory and trauma studies. In our post-memory culture described by Aleida Assmann, that is characterized by constant mediation of memories, these found footages and their delayed processing can have an exceptional importance. As Assmann highlights, the new mode of memory transition, the empathy mode, creates the distance needed between the victims and the viewer of present time if it reconstructs the trauma from the viewpoint of the victims. Forgács's task to bridge the first look, that of the camera, through his own second gaze at the editing table with the look of the protagonist and the present viewer. Second gaze is a crucial term here that originates in the same period mentioned at the beginning in Balázs Béla studio, where Gábor Bódi created his pseudo-archival footages for American Torso, a long feature film shot in 1975. Actually, in the presentation of Peter Lichter, we could listen to a wonderful analysis of this film. But second gaze has to be empowered with all the necessary knowledge and sensitivity for the colonial world and its power-gender relations, creating an installation of that kind. I'm sure long, painstaking research work laid behind the exhibition. On the website of the iFilm Museum, we can find information about it, highlighting the fact that it is able to add an extra dimension to the historiography of the Netherlands East Indies. And Forgács is quoted saying, "I put my films together like musical pieces. I make compositions on the basis of the material I found. They are personal interpretations of history, not documentaries aiming at objectivity." I shall need a few more minutes, if it's okay, sorry about it. I'm trying to sort of shortening it. So, Péter Forgács has posted on his own website the opening lecture by Peter Delpo, a Dutch filmmaker and writer who has made several found footage films himself. He points out a few contradictions. I will highlight the one that I think is the most important. "It is my impression," a quote, "it is my impression that with Péter Forgács's intention, it was possible to liberate these images from the nostalgia of the good old days, and as well to liberate them from a politically correct anti-colonial point of view. Looming Fire exactly brings these home movies somewhere in between on an uncertain foundation with no black or white pointing, no clear-cut answers to the questions they pose, as if we can see them freshly, as if new and untainted. I'm fully aware this is a dangerous claim," he adds, and he lays great stress on the following point. Looming Fire, as counts for all Peter's other work, is no attempt in historiography. It is not a form of history writing. Looming Fire is a piece of art. I think not history writing and art should be juxtaposed here, but the fulfillment of the requirements toward the politics of aesthetics should be highlighted, which is, as I see, able to create a memory community of senses. Instead of a conclusion, I would like to pick up the analysis by Laszlo Strauss that I mentioned earlier. His attempt to domesticate the post-colonial approach in our post-socialist context in his analysis of the Danube Exodus is successful, I think. He argues and confirms that in the context of contemporary East Central Europe, This deconstruction of a storytelling authority is politically significant, as the region recently has emerged from communist dictatorship. By revealing the constant splitting in the rhetoric of the historical subject, Forgács undermines the theoretical possibility of creating any exclusive vantage point to tell the nation's story. Actually, I do not think that we need an exclusive vantage point to tell the Dutch East Indies stories. But when we see the ship arriving, we should think of it as a chronotope, the cultural signifier, the social-cultural entity. The liminal space of the ship and water thus emerges as a contested arena that reveals the continuous flow of intersecting narratives, instrumental in the formation of cultural identities. That is how Strauss' essay begins, in scening the image of the ship so that the arena can be filled with Forgács' heroes, equally empowered to tell their stories, is an important task in curatorial practice. Thank you.